All right. Thank you very much, Sister Beatrice. I do hope that I am sharing my screen and that it's possible for everyone to see that.
Yes, it's possible. We can see it further.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much. So once again, a very good morning to all our guests and also to Sister Olga. Thank you for the invitation. I want to greet my colleague, Father Anthony Makunde, for this brilliant presentation on the working document. And I will go right away to my input, which is going to be on the biblical icons of the working document for the continental stage, relevance and impact in the African context. So this is what I'm going to be sharing on. If you just give me a minute. Okay. Now, so Father Anthony has actually done the hard work for me of introducing what the working document is. So I'm also going to be referring to the same document from which we get this biblical icon, which is enlarge the space of your tent, from Isaiah chapter 54 and reading from verse 2. And I also just want to share, the index of this document. So this is the document we're talking about that Anthony has already introduced us to the concept. It starts with the introduction. The first chapter he mentioned the experience of the synodal journey. Chapter 2, which I have encircled on your screen, is the part which has to do with listening to the scriptures. And as Father Anthony mentioned, it's not really a very long chapter. You can see there, it will start from from page 15 through 18, practically. So just barely 3 pages of the document. But that is the part of the document that speaks to the question of listening to the scriptures, and from where we will have the question of the biblical icon. So just to give you a geography of where, I am beginning this conversation from. Now, therefore, if you went into that part of the document of the continental stage, you would find the principal icon, which is also, used as the title for the document, is this question of the tent in Isaiah 54, verse 2. Even though I have to say immediately that there are subsidiary references in that same chapter to the question, for instance, of the seed. It speaks about in John chapter 12, verse 24, the seed that falls into the ground, and unless the seed dies, it cannot bear fruit. So I think that in that we can actually find a subsidiary image. And I want to just say that it will be interesting that going forward, we have other conversations, that enter into discussing these subsidiary images. For the sake of time, I won't be able to address all the images in the document, but I just want to point out that we could have another conversation later on the question, for instance, of the seed. Again, there is another which I will call another which I will call a subsidiary image, which is taken from Philippians chapter 2, 5-7. The kenosis, though he was in the form of God, Jesus did not count himself equal to the Father. He emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, or if you like, the doulos, the slave. In fact, that actually is the word that is used in the Greek, the doulos, the slave. So we can also look at the question, for instance, what is the impact of this icon, the icon of service, the icon of the servant? How do they impact our understanding of what the church is, in Africa, as well as the synodal process that the entire church is going through? So these are subsidiary images. However, today our attention will be focused principally on the question of the tent. Now, so here is the passage, Isaiah chapter 54, verse 2. It says, and I'm quoting this directly from the document. It says, "Enlarge the space of your tent Spread out your tent cloths unsparingly, lengthen your ropes and make firm your tent pegs. Now, in what I have projected, I have tried to immediately put in clear view the three dimensions of the tent, which underpin this chapter's explanation. So it focuses on three dimensions of the tent cloth, the rope, and the tent peg. And I thought this was very beautiful. In fact, it completely took me by surprise when I saw it, because it seemed very beautiful. So you have the tent cloth, which is used to drape, the space. You have the ropes, and then you have the pegs. So those are the three dimensions I call the architecture of the tent, and that is what underlines what the chapter speaks about. So what about the tent cloth? The tent cloth is that part of the tent which protects from the elements. It talks about the sun and the rain. Fortunately, we don't have much snow in Africa, so we don't have to deal too much with that. But especially the sun and the rain and maybe the dust, and so on and so forth. So the tent cloth protects from the elements. But the other dimension of the tent cloth, and this, by the way, is not my explanation. This is all from the working document. Everything of this is explained in chapter 2 of the working document. So the other aspect of the tent cloth is the ability to stretch outwards. And this is important, because if the tent is able to stretch outwards, it's almost unlimited in its ability to expand, and to include and to bring, other people into its fold. In fact, one of the things that it says about the tent cloth is the fact that it seems to be sometimes not so close, it's open. So there is this ability for people to keep coming, and going, openly, as it were. And that, is an image also of the openness of the church to embrace, as many people as possible, and so on and so forth. So it's a very beautiful image that we have in chapter 2 of what the church in Africa is supposed to be like. One that protects, and of course, in Africa, we can speak endlessly about those who are vulnerable. So this is very important as an image for us. And then the fact that the church needs to continue to be open. Pope Francis has increasingly spoken about the church being able to reach out to the peripheries. And so this is so relevant. Then the second thing is the rope. And it's the rope that holds the cloth together and balances the tensions. And clearly, we know, one of the things that we talked about in Ecclesia in Africa, where the ethnic differences, and so on and so forth, even the doctrinal differences, the difference in emphasis, theological emphasis, and so on and so forth. There are tensions in the church. We cannot run away from that. So the dimension of the rope, the architecture is that which keeps it together, so that when there are winds and when there are storms and and when things seem to be going haywire, the rope is that which holds the cloth together and keeps us protected, keeps us together. So the rope is that which balances the tensions in the structure. The tent peg is what anchors the structure, so it keeps it solidly fixed to the ground, so that it's not that the structure is not destroyed, but also allows mobility. So the tent peg, you can pull it out of the ground and you can move your whole tent to another place. So it's what allows the church mobility. And Father Anthony was talking about, for instance, the main station, the outstation, and the fact that we have to move. The church has to be dynamic. It can't be always in one place. So this is also true. The tent peg is also an important aspect of what I will call, the architecture of, the tent. Now, which makes it possible for us to move from architecture to theology. So like I said, the church, we talk about the tent cloth. The tent cloth is an image of the church which protects, is the image of the church we can stretch outwards. The rope is what will hold our divergences, and balance the tensions, in the church, and so on and so forth. And the 10th peg is the fact that this church is a church of unchanging faith. So the church's doctrine cannot be changed, even though the church can be uprooted from its present location and planted in new ground, and so on and so forth. So this is deep theology that seems to underlie what we are talking about in the image of the tent. And I think that it's very, very important. In fact, when I first read the document and I saw the clarity of these three dimensions of the architecture of the tent underlying the theology, of what the church is in Africa, I thought to myself, oh my goodness, this is really a beautiful image. And no wonder that those who put the document together said this in the 2nd chapter to give us an orientation of what we expect the church to be and what we expect the church to do on the African continent. So this is just to introduce you to what already is in the document. This is in the document, and this is a beautiful image. Now, beyond what is in the document, however, I believe that my invitation to this conversation is to reread this image, and what has been presented to us, this architecture of the tent, as an African student of the Bible, as an African theologian, and to reflect and ask questions about how adequate this image is, and whether it really speaks to and addresses how we feel about ourselves as Africans. Maybe Father Anthony will be able to guide me, because I wasn't exactly sure where the description and the explanation of this image of the tent, in terms of the architecture of the tent, whether it was really from whether it was really taken from the African continent, or whether it was a contribution, let's say, of the General Secretariat to the discussion, having read everything that came from the continent. I am not exactly sure. I haven't been able to find adequate responses to that. But I can say that as an African, it is also possible for us to react and to engage, with this image and the way that the image has been explained, because it is possible that the image was chosen, and rightly so, but how to explain the image to an African is also another thing. And I think that this is what I wish to bring this morning to the conversation. Now, I had a conversation with one of my colleagues who was at one point involved in the discussions about the synod because of his position. And he shared a few thoughts with me about the image of the tent, which I think we need to put into perspective. And he said that at that discussion, I wasn't at that discussion, but a discussion, I think, which was among some African theologians, one of the big concerns that was brought to the table was that anytime the question of the image of the tent was brought up for discussion, there were a few dislocations, a few tensions came up. And the question was, how does the imagery of the tent, what does the imagery of the tent evoke in the African reader or in the African listener or hearer? When an African sees or hears about the image of the tent, how do we react? Now, the first one is what he said to me was that the feedback was that the image of the tent really opens old wounds. I think that there is one of them, someone is unmuted, and I think that's giving us a bit of feedback, maybe. So one of the problems with the image of the tent, it appears, was that it really evoked sentiments of distress, of suffering, of pain. Why? Because in a certain sense, what does the African associate with a tent? The refugee, the migrant, the displaced, the dislodged, the dislocated. And so to speak about, the image of the tent, really, for the African, we have to proceed slowly, because it really could open old wounds for some people. And I think that the image that I am sharing on the screen perhaps brings to mind what we are talking about. We know the number of dislocations that have occurred on the African continent as a result of war. We know when our brothers and sisters who braved the Mediterranean, to cross into Italy, into Europe, they're kept in tents. Today, in the northern parts of my country, we're hearing about an emerging refugee crisis where people are trickling over the border from Burkina Faso as a result of Islamist insurgencies, and are coming to the northern part of Ghana, which is currently in flames. They are displaced. They will be lodged in tents. So to use an image of the tent, in the African context, can really be dislocating for a number of people. So we have to watch the image closely and advisedly before we adopt it, totally. So we have to be aware of this. Let me share a second image, and this is the image of the Ebola crisis, which is a reality, an African reality, which hasn't totally left us. We're still having, pockets of Ebola, here and there. We just, COVID hit us, but thankfully it didn't hit us as hard, but Ebola was a big issue. And we remember how in the time of the Ebola crisis, people had to be isolated in these isolation tents. We remember how, African visas were immediately blocked. We couldn't travel out of our continent anymore. We became a pariah, So these are images, that we need to grapple with. So are these images, is the image of the tent sufficient? Doesn't it seem to reinforce what is a negative, image of Africa? Is the whole of Africa a displaced people, a dislocated people, a people who have no permanency, a people who are constantly, migrating? Is this the image of Africa? So, so we really need to engage, again, and to ask questions about how adequate this image is. Granted, it is a biblical image, but in what way will it be read in the African continent and on the African continent? And this is the problem. Now, the third issue is a methodological issue. When I looked at the image of the tent and looked at the way it was dealt with exegetically, it was very interesting. Like I said, I was quite intrigued. My mind never went to it. In fact, the first time I studied this Isaiah chapter 54 verse 2 was actually just a few weeks ago, but it was in the context of somebody who had asked me, he said, Father, this image is used in the Continental document. So try to unpack it for me. So I went and looked at it, but I never saw, I studied it, but I never realized the architectural dimension of the image. That is the tent cloth, the tent peg, and the ropes. I never saw it. Because, and I think that the reason is that I am conditioned as an African. When I engage an image, I may not be looking at the architecture of the image. I may be looking at something else. So it appears to me that the image of the tent being looked at from its architectural dimension is really, to me, a very Western reading of the text. It doesn't appear to me as very African in its methodology. And that's why I have put two of these images on your screen. The tent, which is just the architecture of the tent, and the tent with the people who live in the tent. And below in the yellow bar that you see on your screen, there is an Akan proverb from Ghana. And I'm going to read it and I'm going to translate it to you. It says, Wonsuma anamon, wasuma anamon, wonsuma sika. Now, the meaning literally is that you send a person, a human agent, you don't send money. What is the meaning of this image? It means that in Africa, the human agent is far more important than any material reality. So when I look at a tent as an African, I'm not looking at the architecture of the tent. I'm looking at who dwells in the tent. That is more important for me as an African, not the architecture, but the person. So I cannot discuss a tent as an African reader of the Bible or as an African theologian and remain at the level of architecture. I have to engage who lives in that tent. And that is, for me, the crux of the matter. So if that is the case, now let's go back to the question of Isaiah chapter 54, verse 2. And here is the text that we have on our screen. Now, if you look at verse 2, which I have placed in red, it says, enlarge the place of your tent and let the curtains of your habitations be stretched out, hold not back, lengthen your cords and strengthen your stakes. So that is where, our passage is taken from. So it's Isaiah chapter 54, verse 2. And you can see that in that verse 2, all the elements of architecture are present. So you have the tent, you have the curtains, that's the tent cloth, you have the cords, that's the ropes, and you have the stakes, and that's the tent pegs. So that's where all the architecture of the tent is focused. But I can see my big brother and professor, Father Ngengi, and I'm sure that he would teach me that it is not sufficient as an African student of the Bible that you just read one verse in isolation. You need to read, at least the whole paragraph, the whole pericope, to be able to see what exactly is going on. So I expand that pericope just a little, and I take it from verse 1 through verse 4. And immediately you expand that pericope, you see that this passage is talking to a woman in three phases of her life. The first one is the childless woman, called the barren one. The second one is the married one. And the third one is the widow. Now, in fact, in my text, which I've highlighted, you can see that I have highlighted in blue text, sing, break forth, enlarge, you, fear not, you, your youth, and so on. All those in the Hebrew are addressing a feminine person. So all this passage is addressing the woman. And the woman at 3 stages of her life. The first one, the woman who doesn't have a child. The second one, the woman who is married. And the third one, the woman who is a widow. So I cannot extrapolate, I cannot separate the woman to whom this is addressed from the tent in which she lives. And I think that as an African student of the Bible, my interest is even more on addressing these images than addressing the architecture. So that is why I look in my, engagement with this text, I am looking not at the tent, but at the person who's dwelling in this tent. And here I have 3 people. The first one, the akhara, the barren, the infertile woman. The second one, the be'ula, the married woman, or the woman, the married woman, the woman who has children. And the third one, the almana. In fact, the word actually in that is the almanuteka, which means your widowhood, but it refers to the almana, which is the widow. And I think that these are the 3 images that have to do with the person actually living in the tent. And the question here, therefore, is which of these images reflects the African church? Is the African church the infertile woman? Is she the married woman? Or is she the widow? Now, let's begin by speaking about the akhara, that is the infertile woman. Now, by the way, we can read through the scriptures, and we find, for instance, in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 14, one of the things that is promised to Israel, if she is obedient in the land, in the promised land, is that she will never be barren, she will never be infertile, and that kind of thing. So infertility, all through the scripture, we can read the story of Hannah, and so on. In the biblical account, is always considered a tragedy. And we know, as an African, we know that the question of infertility is a real problem. If you've been anywhere in Africa, in any parish, and a family that that is struggling with the question of childbirth, what the woman goes through. We know it. So we, as an African, we cannot see the image of the sterile woman and walk by. It's not possible. We have to engage that image because it's a very deep and a very tragic image in our context. And in fact, there's another passage that I quote here. In fact, also in the book of Proverbs, chapter 30, reading from verse 16, in fact, it describes, the situation of barrenness as Sheol, death, practically. So barrenness is almost equated to Sheol, death. And this is a reality, and we need to ask ourselves, what does this image say to the African church? Now, I want to refer to a document, which came out just last year, 2022, which is the Advent letter of the Ghana Catholic Bishops' Conference. In this letter, it refers to the growth trajectory of the church in Ghana. And it says that in the year 2000, the population of Catholics in Ghana was 15.1%. In the year 2010, we were 13.1%. In the year 2021, we are 10%. And the study says that if we continue with the current growth trajectory of the church in Ghana, by the year 2060, there will be no Catholics in Ghana, theoretically. Now, this, for me, and in fact, it was a sense of worry for the entire bishops' conference. It was pandemonium when these statistics were churned out at the last population and housing census in Ghana. We were all worried about what is going on. And so we need to ask questions about whether we are being fertile, the fecundity of the church in Africa, at least in certain parts. This is a real worry. So how does the question about the akara, the church as a barren and a sterile woman, what does it say? How does it challenge the reality on the ground in Africa today? That is a problem. And that is something that for me as an African, I'm willing and I want to engage with, because that is a worrying, image for Africa. Now, the second one is the threat of the widowed church. And I just wanted to make one example, from the book of Lamentation, the whole book of Lamentations, which, is about the Babylonian captivity, lament on the Babylonian captivity, begins with the mention of the widow, and the widow is supposed to be Israel. The widow is supposed to be Jerusalem, that no longer has her spouse. And you know that the image of marriage is really about the image of the relationship between God and Israel. God is the spouse. Israel, is the bride. So the idea of the widow is a church that has lost its relationship, as it were, with God. A church that has become maybe a social organization. A church, that has left, its faithfulness, again, in the book of Hosea, its faithfulness to her spouse. And again, here we need to engage with this image. What is the image of the church in Africa? Are we really seen as, a faithful bride? Or have we chosen our own path, and abandoned, the walk with Jesus, the walk with the spouse? Is that the image of the church? Or at least, is it a threat? So this is, again, another image that we need to engage with. And then, finally, we have the image of the Beula, which is the woman. And I just want to refer to Ecclesia in Africa, number 63, which said that taking the church as God's family as its guiding idea for the evangelization of Africa, the Synod Fathers acknowledged it as an expression of the church's nature, particularly appropriate for Africa. Now, it seems as if of the three images, the ideal image is the image of the woman as the Beula. The woman that has a relationship with her spouse, God in this case, and is also fertile, and is fecund, and is expanding, is growing. That is the image, the ideal image of the woman in the tent. So I'm not saying that we should jettison the image of the tent. I'm only saying that we should read the image of the tent within the wider context of Isaiah chapter 54. And if we do that, then probably we are now reading it in the real African context. And we can, I'm sure that if we went out to, to speak to an African, about these three images of the church, I believe that we will be communicating better what the church in Africa is. The real image of the Africa of the church in Africa must only return to ecclesia in Africa, you know, and we don't need to depart from it. We can still use the image of the tent, but explain it in the way that it speaks effectively to an African audience. And with that, I want to once again thank you, Sister Beatrice, for having me, and Sister Olga. And I'm sure that the engagement going forward will be equally fruitful. Thank you very much.